So, guys, George Pickens just got a whole lot more expensive. Sounds crazy, right? But that's the truth. When you actually sit down and compare the numbers, you'll understand exactly how these league-wide contracts are affecting the Cowboys-GP deal. And on top of that, we've got some direct updates from head coach Brian Schottenheimer about GP that honestly seem pretty encouraging. Let's dive in. What's up, Cowboys? Welcome to the NFL Playbook Cowboys. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. All right, so let's start with George Pickens and where things currently stand with his contract situation. Look, GP signed the franchise tag back in April. That part we already knew, but here's what's been going on since then. He has not been in the building this entire offseason, not once. And I know, OTAs are voluntary. Nobody's forcing him to show up. But when your name is all over the headlines and people are questioning your commitment, your maturity, your future with this team, every single day that you're not in that building is a day the narrative gets louder. And trust me, the media is absolutely loving every second of this. They want the drama. They want the holdout story. They want the chaos in Dallas. But honestly, I don't think George Pickens is giving them what they want, and I respect that. Now, the Cowboys have been very clear. They are not negotiating a long-term deal with Pickens right now. They've held that position firm. But at the same time, they're also saying they have no intention of trading him. So, you've got this interesting situation where both sides are kind of just sitting there. GP is on the tag. Dallas isn't budging on an extension, and yet nobody's making any dramatic moves. And honestly, I think that actually tells you something. This isn't blowing up. This is just business. And you know what? I actually think a lot of people in the media are disappointed by how clean this whole situation has been. They keep waiting for Pickens to say something wild or do something reckless, and he just hasn't. He's been the most mature version of himself through all of this, and that's something worth giving him real credit for. But here's where it gets really complicated, and this is the part I really want you guys to pay attention to. Drake London, wide receiver for the Atlanta Falcons, just signed a 4-year deal worth $141 million. And with incentives, that number can climb all the way up to $150 million. The guaranteed money alone is sitting at $100 million. We're talking an average of roughly $32 to $37 million per season, depending on how those incentives play out. Now, when I first heard that number, I'll be honest with you, my jaw dropped a little. And I immediately started thinking about George Pickens and what this means for Dallas. So, let me break down the comparison, because this is where it gets really interesting. In 2024, Drake London played all 17 games and put up 100 receptions, right around 1,271 yards and 9 touchdowns. Career highs across the board for him. That was his only 1,000-yard season in 4 years in the league. Now let's look at what George Pickens did last year with the Cowboys. He had 93 receptions. Yeah, 7 fewer catches than London, but look at the yardage, 1,429 yards. That is 200 more yards than London put up in his best season, and they both had the same 9 touchdowns. And on top of that, Pickens is averaging 4 yards per reception compared to London's 12.7. That is a significant difference, guys. That means GP is consistently going deeper, making bigger plays, and creating more yards after the catch on average. And here's another thing worth noting. This was Pickens' second time topping 1,000 yards. London only has one such season to his name. So, when London's agent is sitting across the table and getting $141 million, you better believe George Pickens' camp is looking at those exact same numbers and saying, we want at least that, if not more. And honestly, they'd have every right to make that argument. The production is there, the big playability is there, the efficiency is there. I mean, Pickens was a second-round pick. He came to Dallas on a relatively cheap trade from Pittsburgh. And now, because of how these contracts are escalating across the league, the Cowboys are going to be looking at a number they probably weren't prepared to pay when they first put him on that tag. The window to get an economical deal done? I genuinely believe that window has already closed. And look, I get it. I understand the frustration. You've got Dak Prescott on a massive deal. CeeDee Lamb is getting paid. You just brought in pieces on defense that are eventually going to need new contracts too. The money has to come from somewhere. And when you start stacking up all these wide receiver deals, London at 32 to 37 million per year, you're basically setting the floor for what GP is going to demand. The Cowboys aren't just negotiating with George Pickens at that point. They're negotiating against the entire receiver market, and that market just went up. Now, I want to bring up something that I think is flying a little under the radar in all of this Pickens conversation. You know about Ryan Flournoy. Last season, he finished third among receivers on the Cowboys with 400 yards and 4 touchdowns. And what really stands out to me isn't just the yardage, it's the efficiency. Out of his 40 receptions last year, 35 of them moved the chains. You know how valuable that is? That's the kind of receiver Dak Prescott trusts when things get tight. He had moments last season. I remember that game where CeeDee Lamb was out, and Flournoy stepped up and showed everybody he could carry the load when called upon. He's only going into his third year. Third-year breakouts are very real in this league. I'm not here to tell you Flournoy is George Pickens. He's not yet anyway. But the reason I bring him up is this. If the Drake London deal is pushing GP's price tag into territory that's just not financially realistic for where this Cowboys roster is right now, then Flournoy becomes a very important conversation. Because if Dallas decides they can't justify committing that much money to the receiver position on top of everything else they've got going on, having a developing, trustworthy target like Flournoy makes that decision a little less painful. It gives Jerry some options, and we all know how much Jerry loves having options. So yeah, keep your eye on Flournoy this offseason and throughout training camp because he could end up being a bigger part of this story than people think. Alright, so now let's shift over to the actual OTA update because this is where things get a little more positive, and I don't want us to lose sight of that. So, Brian Schottenheimer, our head coach, was asked directly about George Pickens before one of the OTA practices. And what he said was actually pretty measured and, honestly, kind of reassuring. He said he spoke with GP the day before. He said communication has been good. He acknowledged that Pickens has a football camp this weekend and that he's taking care of his business. And then when someone pushed him and asked whether GP will be there for the mandatory minicamp, Schottenheimer said, and I'm paraphrasing here, he hasn't discussed the mandatory session specifically, but he expects Pickens to be there and believes he's in a good spot. Now look, read between the lines a little bit. Taking care of his business. I think that means GP is not going to put himself at risk running around involuntary workouts without a contract. And I respect that. That is smart. That is professional. You don't see him out here making noise on social media. No cryptic posts, no drama. He signed that tag early. He's been out there throwing with teammates like Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb away from the facility. He's staying sharp, staying connected, and staying quiet. That is the George Pickens the Cowboys need him to be. And then we got a report from a source close to George Pickens saying that he will be at the mandatory minicamp next week. And honestly, guys, that should not surprise any of us because Dak Prescott himself has said when it's time for GP to be here, he will be here. And I've believed that all along. Pickens is not going to blow up his situation over voluntary OTAs. He's too smart for that now. The maturity level is there. He's around the right people. Dak, CeeDee Lamb, a coaching staff that genuinely cares about him. Schottenheimer straight up said they love him. That matters. So, here's the bigger picture that I want to leave you with. Whether the Cowboys figure out a long-term deal or not, whether they tag him again next year, which by the way, would put the numbers somewhere around $60 million guaranteed over 2 years, which is honestly hard to walk away from, or whether they eventually move on and get draft capital back. George Pickens is going to get paid. That bag is coming for him one way or another. The Drake London deal just made sure of that. And right now, the best thing GP can do is exactly what he's doing. Staying professional, showing up when it counts, and letting his play do the talking when the lights come on. Because honestly, if he comes out in 2026 and does what he did last year, won 400 yards, 9 touchdowns, being that explosive big play threat, this conversation about whether he's worth the money is going to answer itself real fast. I'm fired up for this season, guys. I'm excited to see George Pickens in that Cowboys uniform, and I genuinely believe this is all going to work out. And look, even if the Cowboys do end up franchising him a second time next year, that's still $60 million guaranteed over 2 years for GP. That's not a bad situation at all. And if Dallas decides they want to trade him somewhere down the line, he still breaks the bank wherever he lands. Either way, George Pickens wins. The only question is whether the Cowboys are smart enough to make sure they win too. Tell me what you think in the comments. Like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. DC4L. We'll talk soon.